The sound came before anything else. Not a performance, not a busker's practiced charm, just a melody rising up from the cold pavement of Denmark Street on a grey October afternoon in 1971. Thin, uneven, missing notes that should have been there, and yet somehow more honest than anything London's most famous music street had heard in years. The song was Let It Be, and the girl playing it had 5 strings, a cracked guitar body, and 14 pence in an open case at her feet. Her name was Clara Webb. She was 15 years old. She had been sitting on that same patch of wet pavement every afternoon for 3 weeks, and in 3 weeks not a single person had stopped. Not really. Coins dropped without eye contact. Footsteps slowed and kept moving. The city did what cities do. It absorbed her, filed her away under things it did not need to acknowledge, and walked on. Clara kept playing because stopping felt like losing something she could not afford to lose. For a moment, everything on that street was exactly as it always was. The noise, the indifference, the cold. And then, 50 feet away, a figure in a long brown corduroy coat turned the corner from Charing Cross Road, hands buried in his pockets, head slightly down, moving with the quiet, purposeful stride of a man who had somewhere to be and no desire to be there. He heard it, and his feet, without any instruction from the part of him that was in a hurry, that was tired, that had just come from a meeting that left him feeling like music had been reduced to a number on a page. His feet slowed, then stopped. For a moment, no one moved. The girl kept playing. The man stood still in the middle of the pavement as London parted and flowed around him like water around a stone. Something was happening on this street that had not been planned by anyone. But that moment didn't start there. It started 6 months earlier, in a kitchen in Islington, on the last Sunday morning Thomas Webb would ever play guitar. If this story already has your heart, stay with it, because what George Harrison did next, nobody talked about for 30 years. Thomas Webb was not a famous man. He was not a musician by trade, not a performer, not someone whose name appeared on anything except a postal service employment record and the lease of a narrow terraced house on Caledonian Road in Islington, North London. He was 44 years old, and he loved 3 things without reservation: his wife Margaret, his children, and music. Not in that order. Sometimes music came first, and he was honest enough with himself to admit it. Every Sunday morning, without exception, Thomas pulled his old acoustic guitar from the corner of the kitchen and played while breakfast cooked. It was not a concert. It was not practice. It was something closer to prayer, a private conversation between a man and the part of himself that the working week tried to bury. Clara would sit on the kitchen counter with her feet dangling, watching his hands, memorising the chord shapes before she was old enough to form them herself. By the time she was 11, she was playing beside him. By 13, she was better than he was, and Thomas Webb would laugh about it with a pride so large it embarrassed him. He bought her guitar from a second-hand shop on Holloway Road, £3. A warped neck, scratched body, strings that needed replacing. He spent one Saturday afternoon setting it up properly, tightening, tuning, winding new strings with careful hands, and presented it to Clara on a Sunday morning like it was something precious, because to him it was. Thomas Webb died on a Wednesday in April 1971. A heart attack. No warning, no goodbye, no chance to fix the guitar he had knocked off the kitchen chair the night before and promised to repair on the weekend. He never got his weekend. Clara stopped speaking for 3 weeks. When she came back to herself, she came back through the guitar. The same broken instrument, the crack still unrepaired, the electrical tape her father's hands had wound around the nut, still holding it together. She could not fix it. She could not let it go. So she played it. Denmark Street in October 1971 was not a place that made room for grief. It was a street of business, music publishers behind frosted glass doors, Guitar shops with instruments hanging in rows like expensive wallpaper. Session musicians carrying cases with the brisk efficiency of men who charged by the hour. Everyone on Denmark Street knew what music was worth. They had the invoices to prove it. Clara arrived every afternoon at 3:30, straight from school, and sat in the same spot outside the shuttered doorway of a closed sheet music shop 3 buildings from the corner. She opened the case, positioned the broken guitar in her lap, and played. She played Let It Be because it was the song her father had been teaching her the Sunday before he died. They had not finished the lesson. Clara had been finishing it every afternoon for 3 weeks. The street did not care. A shopkeeper asked her twice to move along. She moved 6 feet and came back the next day. A group of older boys stopped once, not to listen, but to laugh at the guitar. One of them called it firewood. Clara looked straight through them until they got bored and left. A woman dropped 2pence into the case with the tight, efficient gesture of someone paying a toll. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody slowed down long enough to hear that the girl playing was not performing. She was grieving, openly, in the only language she had left. By the 3rd week, Clara had stopped expecting anything from the street. She played for herself, for her father, for the Sunday mornings in the kitchen that existed now only inside the music. The 14 pence in the case was not failure. It was simply what the world thought her grief was worth. She was in the middle of this thought, hands still moving, the melody carrying itself forward on muscle memory alone, when the footsteps behind her slowed. She did not look up. People slowed sometimes. They always kept walking. These ones didn't. Don't go anywhere, because what happens in the next 60 seconds, nobody on that street saw coming. George Harrison was 28 years old in October 1971, and he was quietly losing his relationship with music. Not his ability, that was intact, perhaps sharper than it had ever been. What he was losing was the reason. The Beatles had been finished for 18 months, dissolved in a wreckage of legal disputes and public bitterness that turned something sacred into a courtroom argument. John was in New York, writing angry songs about the past. Paul was in Scotland, trying to forget it. And George, the quiet one, the one the press had always treated as a footnote in his own band, was in London on a Tuesday afternoon, walking away from a publishing meeting that had spent 90 minutes discussing the monetary value of songs George had written in moments of genuine feeling, reducing them to figures on a ledger, and he was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. He turned onto Denmark Street and heard it. Let It Be, played slowly, played on something that sounded damaged, thin, uneven, a missing fullness that should have been there, and yet played with a quality that stopped him mid-stride, like a hand pressed flat against his chest. It was not technical. It was not impressive in any conventional sense. It was honest, devastatingly, unmistakably honest. The kind of playing that only happens when the person holding the instrument is not thinking about how they sound, when they are thinking about something else entirely, something that hurts. George stood on the pavement for 10 full seconds before he moved. He walked toward the sound and found a girl, 15 maybe, cross-legged on the wet concrete, eyes closed, 5 strings carrying a 6-string song through sheer insistence. The guitar was a catastrophe. Cracked body, electrical tape at the nut. The kind of instrument that should have been retired months ago, and hadn't been because whoever owned it could not bear to let it go. George Harrison crouched down to her eye level. Clara felt the shadow first. She opened her eyes and found a man in a brown corduroy coat looking at her with an expression she had not seen from a single person in 3 weeks on this street, like she was completely, entirely visible. "That's ours," he said, quietly, not unkindly, like a statement that was also a question. Clara blinked. "Sorry?" "That song. We wrote it. A pause, almost self-deprecating. Paul, mostly, but still. The recognition arrived the way cold water does when you step into it, slowly at first, then all at once, then impossible to ignore. Clara looked at the face 3 feet from hers, and the world she had been living in for 3 weeks, the grey, indifferent, pavement and 14-pence world, tilted completely on its axis. You're... She could not finish the sentence. Yeah, George Harrison said. Don't make a thing of it. His eyes moved to the guitar. He studied the crack along the body, the electrical tape, the 5 tuning pegs where 6 should have been. When he looked back at Clara, his expression had shifted into something quieter and more personal. How long has it been like this? Clara answered without deciding to. Since my dad died. April. He knocked it the night before and said he'd fix it on the weekend. She stopped. He didn't get his weekend. George Harrison said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the guitar with an expression Clara would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately. Not pity, not sympathy, but recognition. The look of someone who understood something specific about loss and objects, and the way the two become tangled together until you cannot separate them. He taught you to play? George asked. Every Sunday, Clara said. In the kitchen. Mine too, George said quietly. My mum. Kitchen table. He looked at the guitar again. Same thing. For a moment, no one on Denmark Street moved. The city noise continued around them. Taxis, voices, the distant rumble of the underground. But in the small circle of pavement where a Beatles sat crouched before a grieving girl with a broken guitar, everything was perfectly, completely still. The crowd formed the way London crowds always do, sideways, quietly, with the particular British instinct for pretending not to stare while staring completely. It began with a woman in a wool coat who slowed on the opposite pavement and did not keep walking. Then a young man coming out of a guitar shop 3 doors down who stopped with his hand still on the door. Then 2 more. Then 5. Then, without anyone announcing anything or raising a voice, there were 20 people standing on Denmark Street in the October cold, watching something they could not name, but could not walk away from. Nobody pushed forward. Nobody raised a camera. The crowd seemed to understand instinctively that what was happening in front of them was fragile. The way a flame is fragile. The kind you cup your hands around without being told to. George Harrison did not acknowledge them. He was entirely, completely focused on Clara. He asked about her father, and she told him. Thomas Webb, postal worker, Islington, Sunday mornings, kitchen guitar, 3 chords on a Saturday afternoon that became everything by Sunday. George listened the way that almost nobody listens, without preparing his response, without waiting for his turn to speak, just receiving it, all of it. Then he asked if he could hold the guitar. Clara handed it over with the careful, 2-handed reverence of someone passing something sacred. George turned it over slowly. He examined the crack running along the body. He ran his thumb along the electrical tape at the nut. Thomas Webb's hands had put that tape there, and something in the gesture acknowledged that without saying it. Then he positioned the guitar against his body, settled his hands into place, and began to play. Let It Be. On Clara's broken guitar. 5 strings, cracked body. The sound that came out was imperfect and incomplete, and more moving than anything Denmark Street had heard in years. He played 1 verse, just 1. Then he stopped and held the guitar back out to Clara. You play it better than I just did, he said quietly, because you mean it more right now. Clara's eyes filled. The crowd was completely silent. George reached into the inside pocket of his coat, and what he pulled out was not what anyone standing on that pavement expected. Stay with this, because what was written on that page changed everything. He pulled out a small notebook, the kind a person carries not for appointments or lists, but for thoughts that arrive without warning and need to be caught before they disappear. George opened it to a clean page, uncapped a pen, and wrote something in the small, slightly hurried handwriting of a man whose thoughts moved faster than his hand. He tore the page out carefully, folded it once, and held it out to Clara. "Don't open that here," he said. "Read it tonight." Clara took it with fingers that were not entirely steady. She held it closed, the way he had asked, though every instinct she had was pulling in the opposite direction. George stood. The crowd shifted, sensing the moment changing shape. He looked at Clara for a few seconds longer, not with the distracted half-attention of someone already thinking about what comes next, but with the full, settled attention of someone making sure they have seen a person completely before they leave. "Keep playing," he said. Then he put his hands back in his pockets, turned up the collar of his corduroy coat, and walked back into London. The crowd parted for him without a word. Within 30 seconds he was gone, absorbed back into the city as quietly as he had stepped out of it. The 20 people left standing on Denmark Street looked at one another, and then at Clara, who was sitting very still, with a folded piece of notebook paper held in both hands and an expression on her face that none of them could read. Slowly, one by one, they moved on. The street returned to itself, the taxis, the voices, the business of the afternoon reassembling around the space where something extraordinary had just occurred. Clara sat alone for a long time before she packed up. She placed the folded note carefully in the inside pocket of her school blazer, closed the guitar case over the 14 pence, and walked home through the early dark. That night, in her narrow bedroom in Islington, she unfolded the page. George Harrison's handwriting was small and slightly uneven. The note said 7 words that Clara Webb would carry in her wallet for the next 32 years. "Your father didn't leave. He's in the music." The next morning there was a knock at the door of the Webb house on Caledonian Road. A young man stood on the step, professional, quiet, discreet. He was holding a guitar case. Inside was a 1968 Gibson J45 acoustic, clean and perfectly tuned, 6 strings, in a case lined with dark red velvet. No card, no name, just the guitar. Clara's mother stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth. Clara understood immediately. She carried it upstairs and placed it beside her father's broken instrument, not replacing it, not retiring it, just letting them exist together. The broken one and the whole one. The past and whatever came next. She went back to Denmark Street the following Tuesday. Same spot, same open case, but this time she played the new guitar, and the sound that rose up from that pavement was full and clear and alive in a way that made 3 people stop within the first 5 minutes, then 4 more. Then a small crowd that stood in the October cold and listened without being asked to. Clara Webb never became a rock star. She became something quieter and more permanent, a music teacher. 31 years in secondary schools across North London, teaching teenagers who believed music was not for them, that it was, in fact, exactly for them. In her classroom, 2 guitars always hung on the wall. Students asked about the broken one every year, without exception. Clara always told them the same thing. Broken things can still make music. The cracks don't silence you. They just change the sound. She kept the folded note in her wallet until the paper went soft at the creases. 7 words in slightly uneven handwriting. The truest thing anyone had ever said to her. Her father didn't leave. He was in the music. Every Sunday morning, in every song she ever played for the next 50 years, Thomas Webb was in the room. If this story moved you, subscribe. We tell stories like this every single week. And and share it with someone who needs to hear it today.